All right, so we are live, and I know we're going to have people who are going to flow in and out, and that is fine. And I've actually pinned your spot on here, Minda, to the front so people can see that. I am the CEO of a company called Females in Finance. We are a community, a networking community for women who work in financial services and financial technology, as well as the men who champion that work and support feminine talent. And I did research before I even started the group, about what is it that we needed to do to change financial services today. And when I got into it, what I really thought we had was a gender parity problem. I thought it was going to come in, there's not a lot of women. What we really have is so much deeper than the gender parity problem. And you already know this because of your book, which we're going to talk a lot about. And that is, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion problem that is rampant. I tell everybody, financial services, we don't do numbers great. We do apathy great. We do nothing. We change nothing. We totally stick to that. So, with that, I'd like to have you introduce yourself, because I think you do a better job of it than I would ever do, and talk about how you got to write this beautiful book that has 600 tabs on it that I
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you and Females in Finance. And my name is Minda Harts, and I can now add author to my resume. But previously, before that, I spent 15 years in corporate and nonprofit roles in fundraising. And so I was a fundraising consultant, and I went on site to universities and colleges and helped them build out their endowment strategies. And now I think we live in a world where you hear more about development work, but back then it was kind of a weird thing. Oh, you take people out and wine and dine them and raise money. And so I was the only one in those rooms. And after so many years of being the only Black woman, the only woman sometimes, I realized that it got isolating, and there were things that I kind of swallowed a lot, that I realized that I had lost who I was in the workplace because I had done so much to try to fit in that I didn't know who Minda was anymore. And so in 2015, I created a company called the Memo, which helps women of color advance in the workplace, just realizing that, yes, all women do experience levels of oppression, but we don't all experience that oppression the same way. And so talking about that intersectionality, created a podcast called Secure the Seat. And then in 2019, at the end of August, I came out with the book, The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table, because oddly enough, there are no books about the experiences of women of color in the workplace by a major publisher. And so I leaned into my courage to say, in order for us to change some of the dynamics for parity and equality in the workplace, we're going to have to talk about some of the experiences of other women.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, one of the things that you talk about is this idea of, you never saw yourself as an activist. And that to me hit home, because I read a book called, That Escalated Quickly, with Francisca Ramsey. And she says right on the front of the book, the story of an accidental activist. And so when, much to your point about writing this book, it was this idea that you hit an artery that resonated with a lot of people, just as I did in Females in Finance. And what happened was I was getting phone calls. Like, after you do something that's sort of putting a stake in the ground, if you will, people all of a sudden say, oh, well, that's what Minda handles. And then you get those phone calls, right? And I was getting the phone calls of, oh, well, I'm a woman who works in financial services. I'm supposed to talk to you. And I was like, you are? And what I found out is Francisca Ramsey nailed it. With activism, accidental or intentional, comes responsibility. And you took responsibility by taking everything and putting it into words. And it's become sort of a manual of sorts of, this is how we need to behave and go after and change behaviors too, in order to secure those seats at the table. And I think that your book, although it's directed towards women of color, and it says that right on the cover, it's directed to all women. And I challenge anybody who is not a woman of color to read this book in a way that includes you, because it does. And I shared with you in our first call, I was like, wow, this was really tough. Like, this was tough to read. I actually had to call a friend of mine and say, did I miss something? Because I'm like, oh my gosh. And she's like, no, but I think you're actually opening yourself up to that. explain, this point and idea specifically in your writing to the women of color on this, why this book is inclusionary, why this is an inclusive guide for all people to understand why everyone has to have an opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for taking the courageous leap into a book like this. And yes, on the cover, it shows a Black woman or a woman of color with natural hair. It says women of color on the cover. But I think our unconscious bias would say that that's, if you're not of color, you would think that that book is not for you. But it's just as much for women of color as it is for anybody else. Men of color, men, women, however, those who identify gender non-conforming. It's all about the future of work and understanding the people that we work with, our constituencies, our clients, our colleagues, those we manage. How are they experiencing the workplace so that I could be better in tune to some of the things that they're going through? And I think when we put this large, broad paintbrush over women, we miss out on the experiences of all women. And so I did write it with women of color at the center, because oftentimes in the books that we read, we don't read about us. We're often an asterisk, and we don't want to handle the ugly truths of race in the workplace, right? And so I think for white men and women and men of color who read the book, I think this is a really great manual to say, you know what, I might not know everything there is to know about women of color and what they experience, or Black women. And so this is really good for me, because I may be very well intentioned, but I might be also creating some issues. And I think instead of, the last thing I want to say about that is, part of our activism, we're all activists in a way. And we just have to choose how we want to lean into our courage. And so if I know that something, catastrophic has happened in the news that would primarily be more maybe detrimental to someone with maybe Black skin, and I'm a white individual, now understanding, oh, this next issue on the news might be hurtful, right, to them. And so now maybe I can be a better colleague. I can understand, I can acknowledge, I can ask them how they're feeling when they are the only one and these things happen, not just circle around during, Black History Month, but
yes,
realizing that I can be a colleague and a good human. And ultimately, this creates better relationships, because I think a lot of our issues in the workplace is we don't really know each other, and we haven't got a chance to really have those conversations to see that we're both just humans.
Exactly right. And, I have to tell you, as I read through it and I started understanding better, that it is so much more than, although, like you said, what you're seeing on the cover, it really does speak to a lot of what all women go through. I recently read a book by Melinda Gates, who wrote this Moment of Lift. And she says, and you talk about this in your book, and I thought this was so synergistic, and I wanted you to know that. She said, opportunities have to be equal before you can know if abilities are equal. And opportunities for women have never been equal. And so if you think about that as you layer and peel out the onion of women, okay, so take the gender part out. Let's add a person of color or a different, not just ethnicities, but what about their educational background? The more that you keep unpeeling that, the more and more that those opportunities escape that person to have a chance to do something, right? Yeah. So if the only opportunities are that I get really discouraged when I hear someone say, well, the best person for the job should have the job. That might be very true, as long as that opportunity was equally presented to all people who have the ability to fill that job. And you and I both know that that is inaccurate. That's unhappy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's part of it, right? I just spoke at a conference about women in product management, and most of the women in there were not necessarily women of color, but the thing was that at one point in that industry, you had to have a computer science degree, you had to have an engineering degree. Now they're being a little more loose in terms of who has the opportunity to be a product manager. And think about all the people that could have probably done that role, but we put the gates up before they even had the opportunity. And I think that's why we have to have these critical conversations about access and equity.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So if that's the case, and we have to have those conversations in a way that include everybody. I know that one of the other things that Melinda Gates also said in that book, too, in her book, but tied in exactly to yours. It's funny how so synergistically people are telling similar stories, but I think I love the fact that, by the way, I love the way you wrote it because it's like how I speak.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, this was something that hit home for me, but that no group should have to trust another group to speak up for them. And that's one other thing too, that I get really sensitive when people say to me, oh, well, we've taken that into consideration. And I look at the table, and that's like women, looking at a group, a bunch of men who are making decisions about them. And it's like, that's the reason why when I, see the state of California takes the initiative, and so did Massachusetts, on you need to have women on boards. Okay. I don't care if that's mandated or not. And then some people say, oh, going back to, oh, well, then everybody should have the, chance, the best person for the job, yada, yada. That's not the case. We should never have to depend on another group to represent who we are in our voice. And I can't share that and stress that enough. And part of our problem in financial services, quite frankly, is if you go and look at financial service professionals overall tend to be very male, stale, and pale. And if that's the case, if you look at communities that do not look like them, there's an underrepresentation to sometimes no representation of having financial advisors, financial service professionals that look like them in those communities, because we depended on another group to make that opportunity happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important to note, because we can say all day women, 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 but what women are we talking about? I heard a CEO of a tech company say 2 weeks ago, I made sure that we had women on the team. We had 50% women. And then he said, but then when I went to look at it, it was 50% white women. I had no white women.
No representation.
Yeah. And he's like, I didn't realize that, wow, I'm also perpetuating the problem. Right. And so, so I think it is important that sometimes we don't want to admit some of our blind spots.
That's exactly right. My friend Zenelia Harris, who I adore, and I want the two of you to know, Zenelia is amazing. She asked a question on here. How have your experiences changed since the release of the book?
Thank you, Ms. Harris, for asking the question. So for me, I was not sure how it would resonate, right? A book that had, quote unquote, never been written before, but knowing that women like myself were experiencing these issues in the workplace. When my agent shopped the book around, there's 5 major publishers. 4 of them said there's no audience for a book like this. And so again, understanding that everyone does not experience the workplace the same. And so it has resonated with people. And if you bought the book, thank you so much. And if you haven't, I hope that you will. But I'm being now invited after 21 city book tour that I did not expect to go on. Each city, as the book kept getting out there, I kept getting these calls to come to this city, come to this city. And now, as I finished the leg of the tour a couple weeks ago, now I've been busy going into companies because they realize that we need to have some of these critical conversations, and we need to understand how we get to solutions, right? So once we've identified the problem, how do we go about solving it? And so I'm really optimistic that some companies that I never would have imagined would purchase 100 copies of this book and then have me come in and talk about it with their leaders and their colleagues about the experiences of women of color in the workplace. And so yes, we're not maybe where we need to be numbers wise, but the fact that we're at a pivotal point where some companies want to do better, I'm really optimistic that not only will there be other books written by other women, white women and women of color, but that our perspectives are being embraced, that people are at least saying, let me hear what they have to say, which is something that was not able to take place 50 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. So if I activate my voice, I hope that activates other people's voice to say, yeah, this is an issue too. And the more that we all rise up to talk about it, I think that's when people take notice. And so I think all of you, and including yourself, Sheryl, saying that this is important, right? And the more we're saying it, then the more people believe it.
When I hear people, companies, I have to tell you, one of the feedback, because I interviewed a lot of companies before I even started the group, because I wanted to understand how people were recruiting others and training and advancing them. And I felt there was an overwhelming thread through those conversations that companies would say something like this: we provide lots of training. And I'm like, okay, is that training available to everyone? Absolutely. So from the call director, the mailroom, all the way to the CEO, everybody has some of that was like, well, not maybe everybody. I'm like, okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere. So it's not really everybody, so stop saying everyone. But the other part of it, Minda, and you talk about this in your book, is this idea of you sort of become almost too loyal to your job or to your whatever, and you don't actively go out and reach for those opportunities to have that seat at the table, because you're like, they're going to judge me on this if I go take that. And there's a certain point where you're giving people the okay. You're literally, this is the manual to say, you can leave this because you need to go over there, because you need, if you don't have representation at that table, they're not looking to represent you. And interestingly enough, that when I interviewed companies and they told me how their metrics of how they did that, I said, but are you actually taking the time when you get the sign up sheets, if you will, of who wants to sign up? Are you really looking at people and saying, wow, if everybody who shows up to the training is all male, stale, and pale, you didn't hit everybody. And if you don't, another conversation, and you talk about this in the book too, is how do you explain to women of color, all women, whoever that might be, when those trainings, those opportunities come around, what is the confidence, or what is the criteria? What is it that you give them, the skills that say, stop, you need to go do this, because that's how you get that seat at the table. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing. So yes, we can, I kind of build like this bridge in the story where, yes, we're talking about some of the ugly truths, but then we ramp up and talk about what it is we need in our own personal toolkit, because some of this is not all, white men and women's fault, right? Some of this is on is on us. What are we going to do to make sure that we're equipped? And I think as women of color, Black women, I grew up to say, and my family told us, just keep your head down and work hard, right? Maybe some of you have heard that. And why that's taking place, you're missing out maybe on some of the opportunities of being seen and articulating your value and your worth. So maybe some of these committees that we could be actively sitting on or volunteering for stretch assignments, we're waiting on someone to tap us on our back because we have done all this hard work, right? But we have not activated our voice to let the powers that be know we even want this seat. Oftentimes many managers, they aren't invested in your success because often they're just checking the box, trying to get through the day. They have a team. And so sometimes it's not that, no, they don't want you as a Black or brown woman to move forward. It's that you have not told them what they want. And I think we have to say, okay, this is what we want. And if they can't give it to us here, don't spend the next 10 years of your life trying to force someone to move you in a position that they don't want you to be in, right? And so give yourself that option, give yourself that permission to say, there are tables waiting for me that want my expertise. I am an asset, or I'm going to create my own, right? Just know that you have options.
Yeah. And I love that so much, because that actually applies to everyone. I mean, if there is something you really want out of a job or out of a career, I think that all of the advice is super sound, that you're going to have to take a risk to put yourself out there. And you also have to articulate in a way that somebody knows Minda wants that, or Sheryl wants that. Mm-hmm. And, I know Carla and Harris from Morgan Stanley they did a TED talk on having someone have a seat, having representation at that table when the decisions are made. And if you're not actively, when you're given opportunities, and this is everybody listening, when there's an opportunity from hey, putting aside the entrepreneurial people, but people who actually have jobs where they're going in, if you're not actively pursuing and filling out, this is what I'm after, this is what my career goals are, and creating that path, and you talk about that in here, about the work that's involved behind that, then you can't fault people, because you also didn't say that this is what you wanted. And I have to also tell you something else too. The fact that you wrote this book, Minda, and you stood out there for a minute by yourself when the book was written. It's like you stand out there. It is really tough. Yeah. And it's not tough to just stand alone. And it's not tough to stand there when you have a second person. It becomes a lot easier though when you have that third, and then that 10th, and then that, right?
Right,
and
absolutely.
That time that you wrote it though, and you and I talked about this in our very first chat, you had to stand out there alone for a bit.
I had to stand out there alone because these are a lot of things that we talk about behind closed doors, but we have not let others know about it. And so for me to say, you know what, in order for us to change the way that culture shifts, it's going to require us to lean into our courage and push aside our caution. And I said, if I have to kind of be that person, that part of that activist, right? It's like, okay, if I don't do this, I'm not doing it for me necessarily, but I'm doing it for the next generation coming behind me. Because if we don't address some of these inequities, then they're going to experience it. The next generation is going to experience it. And once I understood that it was bigger than me, I was willing to stand alone until that next one came, and that next one, and the domino effect. And I think as women, it's so important that we support other women who are trying to legacy build, and essentially creating more seats at the table is what I look at as legacy building.
So, and I'm going to remind everybody, you're on the call, ask the questions, because Zenelia also said, are people embracing your story and perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I think obviously I couldn't capture the experiences of all women of color in this book, but there are some themes that resonate with all women in the book. And I think that that's the important thing. And I was really intentional about writing a business book in which it was authentic to my voice. So if you were coming over to my house and we were, having a glass of champagne, that this is how I'm talking to you, because this is how we already know the theory of it, but what does it look like in practice? So let's get down to keeping it 100% real. And I think that people are resonating with the authenticity, the realness, and my story is their story. Like, they could have wrote this book as well due to their experiences. And I think now we're saying, okay, I know that I'm not crazy. I know that I'm not alone. I know I wasn't making up these things. Now, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to move forward and make sure that we're not just a large percentage in the future of work, but that we hold down leadership positions when the future of work, comes. So I think that part, I'm just so happy, when they said there's no audience for a book like this, that you all are coming out of the woodworks. And so thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the questions Tony asked, but I want to ask as well. So what can I do as, as a white woman? What is some of the best ally moves that I can make to support you, Minda, the person, support Minda's message in the memo and the women, and be a better community leader?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking the question, both you and is it Ms. Taylor or Mr.
Yeah,
Taylor?
so Tony's got a little bit bigger, a different audience too, and I want to talk to it because Tony is a woman of color as well, and she is a huge connector, a speaker too, and I think there's a lot of people that this story, although everybody can't be on, they will come back and listen, and I want to make certain that one of the takeaways that from here is I want you to tell me directly how I can be, and people who look like me, better leaders and allies, but I also intentionally want to see how my community of 2,300 plus women can help you as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Well, for starters, you reaching out to me and saying, how can I help? Right. When the book when I was standing by myself. So thank you for taking that leap and saying that this is important. So you're doing your part. And for others, tell people about the memo, because the more that the stories and the narratives are being told, the better we're equipped to work with and manage diverse talent. And so for me, if you have a company, purchase this book for all of your staff. I remember when the Lean In book by Sheryl Brown came out, I was still in my traditional workforce. My whole company bought every person that book to read, right? And so whether you identified with it or not, it was an important read, right? And I think that books like this are important reads. So if you have the opportunity to bring me in to speak, Black History Month is coming, Women's Month is coming, but also think about diversifying. When you have an open opportunity on your team, make sure that you have a diverse slate of candidates until you fill it. You know what your numbers are. And so I would just encourage everybody to practice courageous conversations and courageous listening, because the only way we're going to do it is if we listen to what each other has to say, and reading a book like this will allow for that dialogue. So thank you all for your support.
Here's a question I didn't anticipate asking, but I want to. What can we be doing as mothers, nurturers, etc., of young women today to embrace some of the things that you've taught here, that we can make our children better and more, not just inclusive, but just more aware of how the stuff works, right? Because right. I am a mother of, I have 5 kids, 2 of which I have 2 children of color, and they come to me and they ask questions, and I'm going to be honest, there's times where I have to look at them and say, I don't have an answer for that, because I don't. And so maybe what's some of the ways that we can use some of this, but for our littles out there?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that. We're actually in the process of, this is an exclusive for the Female in Finance.
I didn't know this. I promise. I didn't know she was going to.
In the process of pitching a second book and a younger version of the memo, so that, because we realize that we need to talk about these hard conversations and identify when we're on the soccer field, right? When we're in third grade, when we're in fifth grade, and somebody, says a name that we aren't used to hearing. And so I think that talking to I don't have any kids, so, but I think talking to.
I got enough. I can send you some.
I do have godsons and things like that, and nephews, but I think having these conversations and exposing them, when I was younger, my family, we used to go to different churches that had different people that didn't look like us. We used to go to plays that had, people who didn't look like us. We used to go to volunteering at different shelters. And I grew up going to a lot of Judaism events and things, just because my parents wanted us to be well cultured and well rounded and have empathy for people who didn't necessarily look like us. And so I think there's so much at our fingertips, even if it's just a book by a young author of color, right? A child's book, getting your young daughter or son a figurine that isn't white, right? Or that isn't black, and like things like that, at normalizing change inside of our house and the things that we watch on TV. I really love This Is Us. I don't know if anybody watches this show, but I think they just
I'll start crying. I can't even.
Such a great job of incorporating all those different facets and having those conversations. And at the core of it, we all just want the pursuit of happiness in the American dream. And I think that humanity and that empathy, closing that empathy gap, will create for a better culture.
Absolutely agree with that. And, I think that is important, because so many ideas of what you feel, whether it's race or inclusion, all of these things are developed at such young ages. And so I think it's really important, and whatever I can do, whatever my community can do to help you get that word out with young people, 100% know I'm behind you, because it's going to help me be a better parent. It's going to help my friends be better parents. It's going to help us create better employees, entrepreneurs, whatnot, because we're going to be able to actually be in an environment where I want there to be a day. In fact, we were talking about it today with some people here in Houston. I was at a meeting and I said, I don't even want to have a conversation about they. I mean, I realize that that's like pie in the sky, because we're all going to have something that looks and feels different. But I just don't want it to be something where I want it to be like, that's the way it used to be, like in the olden days or whatever kind of thing. And we're still too much there. So anything I can do behind that. I'm going to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get to the link to buy your book, which I share that anyway. At any point that you're doing anything, anybody on this call, I'll make sure they can reach out and get access to your website to get in front of you for speaking engagements. I know that that's something that I want to be very supportive of. And then, again, feel free to fall back on us if there's ever, you're going somewhere. Anytime you're in town, I would love to know, because the Organization for Females in Finance spans across the United States, all of it, and we would love to get cheeks and seats to the events where you're speaking to.
Awesome, thank you. Well, success is not a solo sport, so I thank you for your leadership and for all of you who are leaning into making the workplace work for everybody.
I appreciate it so much. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. We're on the half hour, and you're in San Francisco, which I lived there for 18 years. So you're sort of in my hometown, but St. Louis will always be my home. So I look forward. I hope at one point we can meet in person and I can hug you, because you really have, your words were life-changing. Honestly, I left this feeling like a different person, and it really helped me understand even my children better. So I'm grateful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate all of you, and have a great rest of your week.
All right. You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.